What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 154 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. The last couple of days, I have talked about the first two volumes of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, so today I'm going to talk about the next installment in that series. The Black Dossier by Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill. This is not Volume 3. This is the next thing that came out after the end of Volume 2, but this was not labeled as Volume 3. Volume 3 is actually what came next. So this is sort of an in-betweenquel that takes place during the events of Volume 3, but it's kind of its own thing that, in a way, mapped out the rest of the world of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And we're still seeing stuff that kind of has its seeds here that is playing out in some of the current League of Extraordinary Gentlemen stuff that's going on now. And this story, to put into perspective just how old this series is and how old I am, or how old I feel anyway, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen stuff started in 1999 or 1998, I think, and it lasted 12 issues, and then that series ended. And so a lot of fans of that series probably thought that that was the last of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen that they were going to get. And then in 2007, this book came out. So like 7 or 8 years after the end of the first series, this standalone volume came out. And I feel like an old man because I bought this brand new off the shelf, and it was already 10 years ago. It does not feel like this book came out 10 years ago, but it did. And the plot of this is, it is 1958. It's about 60 years after the previous League of Extraordinary Gentlemen kind of disbanded after the Martian invasion. And Mina and Alan are both still alive. They are immortal. They bathed in these pools of immortality that they found somewhere in Africa. And now the British government doesn't even believe that these two even exist. They aren't even sure if the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen existed at all. We find out that the Big Brother government from the George Orwell novel 1984 actually happened in the late 40s, and that 1984 is actually an inversion of the year 1948. And so the Ingsoc government from Big Brother from 1984, Britain is recovering from that. They are just coming out of that, and Alan and Mina, they go and they steal the Black Dossier, which is this big file on the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and basically has all of this information that they don't want the actual government to own. And then they are being pursued by this guy named Jimmy, who is the grandson of Campion Bond, who was their handler in the previous two volumes. So hint, hint, it's actually James Bond, but they can't actually say that, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. They are being pursued by Jimmy Bond, as well as Emma Knight, and Emma Knight is the character Emma Peel from the Avengers TV series from Great Britain in the 60s, and Knight is her maiden name, so it's Emma Peel and then her godfather. And these three are chasing after Alan and Mina throughout this entire book, and then we are interspersed with different documents from the actual Black Dossier, where these two are actually reading what's in the dossier to see what the government knows about them and what they don't know. And this book is very complex. I have lots of mixed feelings on this. On the one hand, whenever you read the first two volumes, Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill are basically they are able to call every character by the name that they are called by. So Captain Nemo is just Captain Nemo. Alan Quatermain is Alan Quatermain. These characters are in the public domain, so they are allowed to use these characters. The only real example of that that's not the case would be Fu Manchu, who, for whatever reason, he was not in the public domain whenever they were doing the first volume of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, so they just had to call him the Devil Doctor, and they weren't really able to use him like they were able to use Professor Moriarty in the earlier volumes. By the time you get to the Black Dossier, that is no longer the case, because this is still operating under the same premise as the previous two volumes, that all fiction exists in this one world. So you've got characters, especially by this point, when you're almost at the 1960s, you've got characters from TV, characters from movies, characters from radio and novels and prose and music. All these characters from different media all coexist in this one world. But since these characters are quite a bit more recent and they are not in the public domain, it's a little bit difficult to read through some of this because Moore and O'Neill, they have to kind of be very coy with how they reference these characters so that they don't get a lawsuit slapped on them. For example, they can't just outright call this character James Bond because James Bond is not in the public domain. So they are very careful not to call him that, so they call him Jimmy, and they reference his grandfather, and he has the same cigarette case as Campion Bond, and then it's up to you to put together that it actually is James Bond. And then if you're aware of Emma Peel from the Avengers series, it takes a little bit of work to figure out, oh, okay, this is Emma Peel, only she's Emma Knight because she hasn't married Mr. Peel at this point. And there's stuff like that. Some of it is easy to catch, some of it is very difficult difficult and very obscure for anyone to catch. I found myself just about every time that I open this book and I read it, I have to open up this website with annotations from a guy named Jess Nevins, and he does annotations on all of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen stuff, and a lot of these references go over my head, so I will have to open up the website and find, oh, okay, that's what Alan Moore is referring to, or oh, okay, that's what this little visual reference is. Like, there's a visual reference to Blackadder that I definitely would not have caught unless I was reading the annotations by Jess Nevins. So, anyway, this book is, on the one hand, very interesting because whenever I'm reading the first two volumes, I like this premise so much, and I want to see where this premise would go if they move closer to the 21st century, where I'm more familiar with characters from movies and books and TV shows and stuff like that. But at the same time, because the characters of the 20th and 21st century are not in the public domain, this book has to work much harder to be able to use those characters, and it can be a little obtrusive. It doesn't really make reading this book very easy. This book is not an especially easy read unless you are extremely knowledgeable about all the pop culture of the 50s and 40s stuff that they're referencing, and then you might still need the annotations to figure out, okay, why is this veiled reference being so coy and obscure? Oh, okay, it's because this character, if they call him that, then they're going to get sued, or whatever. Also, another thing about this book that's very different from any of the others that came out before this one, the first two, they had some kind of prose section in them. The first one had a prose story about Alan going on this weird mind trip with the time traveler from the time machine. The second one had an almanac that kind of detailed the history of the League and talked a little bit about some of the adventures that Alan and Mina went on after the Martian invasion. This one is really diverse. It's got a lot of weird and interesting stuff in it that the previous volume did not have. At one point, you get a 3D section, and you get these little goggles if you bought it brand new. If you buy it used, you just have to hope that whoever you buy it from has these 3D goggles. You also get a weird little pamphlet that is supposed to exist within the world of the League, and it's kind of a holdover from the Big Brother government. You've got this little children's comic strip that details the life of Orlando. You've got all these different articles and pieces of literature and stuff that are part of the Black Dossier, and each one is presented to us in a very different way. There's this one story that is supposed to kind of poke fun at Jack Kerouac, and it is virtually unreadable. It is like a 4-page prose story that does not have any grammar in it at all, so it's one giant 4-page run-on sentence with no periods or anything. It's extremely difficult to read. Even if you go to the Jess Nevins annotations, he is just basically giving up at that point, saying, I can't read this. If you guys can figure something out, then go ahead and email me and then I'll put it up here. But he couldn't even figure it out. So that's when it's like, okay, this is a little bit difficult to read. I'm just going to skip this and move past it. And the first time that I read this, I did skip a lot of the prose stuff. I just read the comic book stuff, the actual narrative of Mina and Alan on the run from the British government. And when you read all of that, the story is very simple. In fact, there's not much of a story. It's just these guys running from government agents. You don't really have much of a character arc for any of our characters. Basically, they capture the Black Dossier and then they go to this weird fantasy world where you have to use your 3D glasses to see what's going on. There's not much of a story beyond that. But at the same time, if you were definitely looking forward to seeing the 20th century through the lens of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, in the same way that you enjoyed seeing the late 1800s through the lens of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, then you will probably enjoy this book on some level. I know I did. I was very excited to see the late 50s subculture and pop culture stuff in this book. And there's a lot of stuff here that I really enjoyed. There's a lot of stuff that went way, way over my head. And then there's stuff that I just flat out did not like. And I guess that's a good segue into the last chunk of this book, where I find out that Alan Moore is extremely bitter about pretty much everything from the 20th century on up until today. He includes Jimmy Bond in this, but he is not the James Bond that you know from reading the books or watching the movies. This version of Bond is very incompetent, and he's kind of a psychopath. At one point, he tries to rape Mina, and then he doesn't actually get anywhere doing that. But you find out that Alan Moore has this huge disdain for pretty much every fictional character or anything from pop culture as a whole that came after his childhood. He does not like James Bond, so he plays James Bond as a villain in this book. He does the same thing later on in the Century storyline, and I'll talk about that more later whenever I get there. But here is the start of what I started to not like about the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I really like the first two volumes because it's characters from all these different stories of fiction working together to have adventures, and I really wish that we could have had that here. I wish we could have the 1950s version of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Throw in characters from Blackadder, or throw in Jimmy Bond, and you can just call him Jimmy or something like that. I wish that they would do something like that instead of just trying to basically crap all over all of fiction from the 20th century. And you get the feeling that Alan Moore wants to move forward with this world. He doesn't want to be stuck in the late 1800s, but at the same time, he doesn't like all of the fiction from the 20th century, so he doesn't really want to use any of that. It really feels like he's in between a rock and a hard place, and he didn't really want to do this story, but he did it anyway. The last chunk of this book, Alan and Mina, they go to this weird fairy tale land called the Blazing Worlds, and we get to see all these characters from past versions of fiction. We get to see Prospero. We find out that Captain Nemo is in this world at some point, and we see that this is the other realm of fiction. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's very heavy, very meta. It's very self-referential, which is weird because that wasn't really what was going on in the previous two volumes. We didn't really have a whole lot of meta and self-referential stuff in those previous two volumes. It was just characters from fiction working together, coexisting in one world. And we don't really get that here. Here, we find out that Alan and Mina are actually working for Prospero now instead of the British government, and he is the one who sent them on this mission to recover the Black Dossier. And I don't really understand any of this stuff with the Blazing World. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense other than it's a weird fairy tale world. At one point in The Life of Orlando, he talks about how all of the fairy kind, they basically left Earth shortly after the reign of Queen Gloriana, I think during the reign of King Edward. So maybe these guys are all fairies, and then this is like heaven for some human beings like Captain Nemo, and then you've got other characters like Alan and Mina. They can go back and forth between the fairy world. It's a little weird. It goes over my head for sure. Alan Moore, when he wants to be, he is a very brilliant writer, and I think here he's writing something that he understands that, at least myself, I don't understand it. I don't really know what's going on here. I'm sure there are other people who feel the same way. Overall, do I recommend the Black Dossier? Only if you are a huge fan of the first two volumes. If you read those two volumes and you really liked what you read, and you really liked the premise of all these characters from disparate parts of fiction are all working together, and you want to see that continued in later volumes that take place closer to the present day, you might enjoy this, or you might find that it's very unreadable and you can't really understand any of these references because he's not allowed to just out and out reference these characters. He's not able to take these characters and just use them, so he has to be very careful how he uses them. And also, you might find that a lot of these characters, even if you do find out what he's referencing, you may realize that it's something that you wouldn't understand anyway. There's a lot of characters here who come from stories that I don't know where they come from. I think most people have heard of Captain Nemo and Dr. Jekyll and Alan Quatermain. I don't think that people have necessarily heard of Mr. Kiss, who is a character from the late 40s who I believe was written by Michael Moorcock. He's a character that a lot of people probably aren't familiar with, and that's one of the references that he's able to flat out reference because Moore is actually really good friends with Moorcock. So overall, I think that this book is going to be a mixed bag for you. I can't imagine that most people are just going to be absolutely in love with this. You may love parts of it. I love parts of it, and there may be parts of it that you don't like that I thought was fine. But overall, I don't know if this book is necessarily for everyone. I wouldn't even say that it's for most everyone. I would say there's just a very few people that this book is actually for. So overall, those are my thoughts on the Black Dossier. I hope that you guys liked this review, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back later in the week with some other videos. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.